Entertained by Story. I want to tell you a story. The story of Don Pablo Escobar, one of the most dangerous criminals ever to appear in the world. He owned about 80% of the cocaine trade worldwide. One day he imported a load of 25.5 tons into the United States. He carried a heavy load compared to 8 large elephants at once. Pablo Escobar was able to make up to 15 tons of cocaine per day in his sales. More than 4,000 people died at his hands as long as his business was successful. The life story of Pablo Escobar is full of many things that are frightening and amazing. Today I will tell the life story of Pablo Escobar.
Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. That's the full name of Pablo Escobar. The world later named him King of Cocaine. Pablo was born on December 1, 1949 as the third child in a family of 7 children. His father was a farmer, and her mother was a school teacher. And since childhood, Pablo Escobar longed for riches and great success. Stories say, at puberty, Pablo told his relatives and friends he wants to have the greatest wealth of his life. Dreams of great success unfortunately did not match his level of patience. He longed for a shortcut to success, so it made him unable to finish university in Latin American Autonomous University. Pablo dropped out of school and became involved in business, and it often became an illegal trade. There was a time when he worked as a bodyguard, but among his first illegal trades as a teenager under the age of 21. It was to create fake certificates of the college he was studying. And he was selling the certificates to people who needed them in order to find work. Pablo was also involved in the illegal trade in smuggling cigarettes that were not allowed in Colombia. Marlboro cigarettes, but also Pablo was involved in the illegal trade of car theft when he was 26 years old. Through his illegal trade, he was able to successfully set up a bank account amounting to $100 million of Colombia. For this it took root in his heart. The roots of believing that the criminal way of life is the right way to achieve the goals he has been dreaming of since he was a child. In 1970, Authority to Combat Drug Abuse, Drug Enforcement Agent, the United States declared war on the use of heroin in the United States. For DNA tests, they thought heroin was the most dangerous drug, and they argued that cocaine was not capable of bringing about addiction or making the user change and become a criminal. But this was a very serious mistake. Then Pablo saw the role and weakness of DNA. Pablo knew more about the drug world than DNA. What he saw Pablo, it is likely to make cocaine one of the most marketable drugs in North America. During this period there were very few cocaine users in the United States. But Pablo saw an opportunity to make cocaine one of the most sought-after drugs in the United States and around the world. Pablo researched and discovered the coca crop grown in Bolivia. And he discovered Bolivia's coca is much better than coca grown in Colombia. Pablo focused on the cocaine business and decided that his product must be better than the cocaine commonly used in Colombia. In 1975, Pablo traveled to Bolivia. There he met Roberto Suarez Gomez, whom his friends preferred to call him Al Padrino, means the Godfather, the leader of a gang called La Corporación. Suarez was the only person running and coordinating the coca crop in Bolivia and Peru. During this period Suarez already had a large network in South America. And a famor, also with influence as well as military. So it was not an easy task for the young Pablo to persuade Suarez to agree to do business with him. This Suarez was so powerful that he had his own air force and land soldiers, about 1,500, who were trained in the military in Libya. But Pablo, with his clever tricks in the criminal world, was able to convince Suarez of his strategy to seize the cocaine market in the United States. The strategy that showed him Suarez will get him richer if he agrees to do business with Pablo. Also Pablo gave Suarez an advice that to create influence in government. And Suarez succeeded in infiltrating his younger brother into government. His younger brother Suarez became an interior minister. So with that title, all defense and security instruments are under his control. Then boldly Pablo urged Suarez to make sure they met the Cuban leader, Fidel Castro, to ask him to be their partner. True, Pablo and Suarez managed to meet Fidel Castro, and their great request to him, it was to allow them to smuggle their drug paraphernalia into his country Cuba and neighboring countries without barrier. History says Fidel Castro accepted them on two terms. The first is that they will pay millions of dollars for the privilege. And secondly, the drug should not be sold in South America, but it should be shipped to North America for sale. Where Fidel Castro, he stressed that he would be happy to see young American capitalists ruined by drugs. After coca from Pablo entering the U.S. market, demand for the cocaine business grew exponentially, and now Pablo officially started his own gang and called it Medellin Cartel. Pablo created effective networks for his drug dealers in Florida cities and California, along with other U.S. states. Pablo Escobar set out to capture the cocaine market in North America. And this was evident from his commercial efforts. So that for the rest of the time he is a few steps ahead, unlike his fellow commercial competitors. In order to successfully ship its business cargo more reliably, Pablo Escobar bought about 15 medium-sized planes. And he also bought 6 helicopters. He also bought 2 small submarines. And these submarines were used for transporting large loads of drugs. By 1985, Pablo was shipping about 70 to 80 tons of cocaine per month. And he was holding 80% of the cocaine market in the United States. And in this period, his gang Medellin cartel was earning $70 million in revenue. And their annual revenue reached $21.9 billion. Pablo Escobar made a lot of money through this illegal drug trade. In 1990, Pablo's personal wealth amounted to $30 billion, equivalent to $54 billion in current accounts. The famous Forbes magazine then named Pablo as the 5th richest man in the world. And the richest criminal did not occur in world history. Then, due to the excessive wealth of Pablo Escobar, he dared to build his house, which was like paradise kilometers. Pablo bought a very large area, and there he built his abode for himself and his family. And he called it the abode, Hacienda Napoles. Inside of his house was a private airport. There was a special section for storing luxury cars and luxury motorcycles. And not just to run them but to watch them. And there was a motor racing arena. There was also a bull fighting arena. All this he kept in his palace. And also inside there was a zoo, where Pablo collected different species of animals from every corner of the globe. At the entrance gate to the Pablo Escobar house, the upper part of the gate hung the plane. A real plane, that is a plane that was capable of transporting passengers. But Pablo put the plane there as just a decoration. It was also a historic bird in its lifetime. It is a pipeline type PA-18 Super Cup, with tail number HK617P, and this was the first flight he used Pablo to load his first load of cocaine into the American country. Pablo Escobar launched a campaign to pocket the Colombian government and all its defense agencies. Pablo had a motto that plata o plomo, silva or lead, means money or ammunition. With this motto, what was happening was that, if you are a government person, you should be an obstacle to its illegal trade. Then he will give you money as a bribe and let his smuggling pass. But if you refuse to receive money, then he shoots you. That is the basis of this slogan. Plata a plomo, that is, choose money or ammunition. This policy made Pablo feared by many government officials, with security agencies, and it led many to choose plata, means money, fearing for their lives. This helped Pablo Escobar to have more puppets in the government and security forces in Colombia. But this policy cost the lives of so many people. Those who refused to receive money from Pablo. Pablo killed more than 4,000 people who wanted to be a hindrance to him, or the other ones who were his enemies. The men included 200 court judges, no more than 1,000 police officers, and some became journalists, and other government officials. History recall as 1985, where Pablo invaded Colombia's highest court. After a lengthy debate in Parliament over changing constitutional provisions that prohibit Colombian citizens from being transferred to another country. This issue was directly aimed at Pablo Escobar, because the Colombian government was under intense pressure from the United States. They should amend the constitution to allow a criminal citizen of the country to be handed over to a foreign country. This was a preparation where Pablo Escobar being arrested. Then he should go and be prisoned in the United States, because the Americans know the evil he was doing to them by pouring cocaine on the city streets in that country. Pablo did his best to bribe the government, and even to warn that such constitutional changes should not take place. But the government continued the process due to the pressure they were receiving from the Americans. It is narrated that Pablo Escobar was swearing in front of his closest people to be never accept confinement in the United States, and he had a saying he was saying, "It is better to be in a Colombian grave than to be alive in an American prison." After his efforts to warn the government not to change the constitution failed, Pablo hired a guerrilla group called M19 to help them solve his problem. November 6, in 1985, the Colombian Supreme Court was in session to discuss and approve the constitutional amendment. But before concluding their sessions, M19 militants sent by Pablo raided and captured the High Court for 2 days. And more than half of the judges were killed and the rest were taken hostage. The exiled judges came to be used as a necessary condition to force the government to stop amending the constitution in order to release the judges. After the government stopped reforming the constitutional amendment, especially the issue of handing over criminals to foreign countries, the abducted judges were released. Pablo is remembered for the assassination of presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán. If it is another way to fulfill its plata a plomo policy, presidential candidate Galán was leading in the referendum, and he was the one who was expected to win the Colombian presidential election in 1990. But one of the biggest policies he was preaching in every corner of the country was to fight drug gangs, mainly targeting the Medellin cartel gang and its leader Pablo. Pablo sent him a letter from a mailbox warning him to stop the policy. But Mr. Galán remained steadfast in his campaign activities. Mr. Galán. One day he arrived in the town of Martellon where Pablo was very influential and that was where he came from. And there were citizens who tried to kill Galán by throwing a hand grenade at him. But fortunately Mr. Galán was safe. But Pablo himself now went to work by hiring special shooters and tracking Galán movements and ordered them to shoot him. A few weeks later he was on a campaign in Socha town. Galán was on the platform to address, continuing his campaigns, but before he even greeted his people, he was shot and killed instantly. But even for this brutality, Pablo was a favorite of many Colombian citizens, because Pablo was a man who helped the poor in Colombia probably more than even the government itself. Pablo devoted much time to improving social services such as building a hospital, school. Pablo Escobar built thousands of homes for the poor and invested heavily in building a Catholic church and houses of worship. Also, Pablo built a children's development center in football and sponsored various senior football clubs. And he built the most modern football stadiums and other sports. And it got to the point where Pablo gave money to the residents of the town of Medellin, so they could solve their various problems. This made the people love him and turn a blind eye to all the crimes he was committing. It got to the point where all the residents of the city of Medellin were his personal bodyguards. They kept telling him every time they saw the foreign police entering even secretly into the city. Or sometimes they were giving false information, or refrained from saying anything when asked by security agencies about Pablo Escobar movements. The next president who won the election later, after the death of Galán, he decided to a deal with Pablo Escobar. The president offered him that to surrender and stop all his activities. And if he does, so the president promised him that he will lessen the severity of the sentence on all wrongdoing. But he also promised her a prison sentence for many privileges. Part of that privilege was that Pablo Escobar will build his own prison, which will be a mansion. Also he will stay there according to the sentence he will serve. The prison was called La Catedral, means cathedral, so Pablo built a magnificent prison that housed a casino. It was a nightclub. As if that wasn't enough, the prison had a football field. It had a bathtub. It had a more sophisticated bar. There was a waterfall that was carefully crafted. And also, the Pablo cell room in the prison had a large circular bed around it. There was also a large television in front. This prison was completely different from all the prisons you have ever heard of. For this prison, despite being a state property, but his drawings were drawn and designed by the prisoner himself. It was painted according to what he wanted. Pablo Escobar. Today in the Medellin mountains of Colombia. That's where the mansions are. Which was the Pablo Escobar prison. A prison that was built in 1991. As if this were not enough, this prison had a special children's playroom. Which, she prepared it for her children whenever they visited her in prison. And there was also a telescope for him to see in the town of Medellin where his family lived. And every evening his family talked to him while watching it on the telescope. Surely this prison was a luxury and no torture or punishment for Pablo Escobar. For even the prison guards who were guarding the prison there were chosen by the prisoner himself. Even Colombian police were not allowed to approach the prison 12 miles away. But far from it all, Pablo did not fulfill his agreement with the president. He still continued to do illegal business and his crimes outside the prison. This prompted the government to turn on him and they arranged for him to be transferred to other prisons where people like him were imprisoned. They were also prisons with maximum security. Pablo was shocked by the plot. July 1992. Pablo has already served 1 year and 1 month in prison. He escaped and began to live in hiding by evading the government. Also his enemies organized a group that retaliated and killed more than 300 people of Pablo Escobar. Pablo was not in danger of being hunted by the police alone. But even his enemies, he and his family had to move to another location. 16 months since he escaped from prison. On December 2, 1993, police arrested Pablo Escobar over an apartment building. There they attacked each other with bullets. After shooting each other enough, Pablo Escobar was killed that day after being shot in the head at the age of 44. The United States and the Colombian government rejoiced, but most citizens wept and mourned. In his tragedy many people really flooded. It is estimated that more than 25,000 people showed up in Medellin to rest their beloved Pablo Escobar. Remember, these are the poor people he built houses for school, churches, hospitals, playgrounds and used to give them money to spend with their families. Although on the pages of history it is written that he was killed by the police by being shot in the head part of the ear. But on the other hand, his family does not believe in it. His brother Pablo says that Pablo Escobar making a promise saying, if he is arrested in an unsatisfactory manner, then he will shoot himself and kill himself.
A lot of evil about Pablo Escobar we have talked about. But Pablo Escobar, when the village comes from Medellin, they refer to him as among the saints despite all the evil he did. But to the people where he appeared he did many good deeds. Pablo Escobar built more than 1,000 houses. Pablo Escobar built schools and hospitals for those in need. It is not enough. Pablo Escobar cared about the comforts of the people when he came from Medellin. He sponsors sports teams as well. This was king at Medellin. That's how we end this Pablo Escobar story today. Don't miss other story next time.